Hello. Here we are in the midst of this pandemic, which has confined many of us largely to our homes. Many of us have been fortunate to have golf as something to do, as a way to get outside, as a way to share some camaraderie from a distance. Lots of things that were otherwise in scarce supply for us. My time playing golf in recent months has caused me to think about my fairly large accumulation of sand wedges that I've obtained over the last 25 years or so, and it made me think that I might have some suggestions for other golfers out there. I've played golf for over 50 years, starting when I was 12, and I've been fairly intense most of that time about the game. Enjoyed a lot. Got my handicap down into mid-single digits at one point. Not there anymore, but I've definitely focused on the game and learned maybe a thing or two. I think that I have a couple of insights that you won't hear anywhere else, and the reason I say that is because when I go look at sand wedges for sale in the big superstores, hundreds and hundreds of them with a bewildering array of stampings, numerical stampings on them, stampings like 5411, 5610, 5612, 5810, and so on. What I have seen leads me to want to focus on not only the loft, which is the first number, but the bounce. I think bounce is hugely important in deciding which clubs to carry in your bag. I'm going to suggest that you should carry simultaneously in your bag 2 sand wedges. And that's going to sound strange, but bear with me. And furthermore, I'm going to suggest that they be heavy sand wedges with swing weights in the E's. And right now, the only ones for sale on the market are in the D's, but I will tell you that it's easy enough to acquire heavy sand wedges off of eBay if you look in the right places. So, but let me start with a question to kind of tee this up, as it were. What is the club in your bag that you use the most after the putter and the driver? Well, it's your out of position club, because you often find yourself, when approaching the green, out of position, as they say on the weekend broadcasts. It's your sand wedge. In other words, when you've missed the green left or right or long or in a bunker, you typically reach for a sand wedge, and that's a good choice, but you need to be attentive to which wedges are available, which wedges you choose to make available in your bag. And I would suggest that you really need to have 2 wedges in your bag. One, a low bounce wedge, the other, a high bounce wedge. And by now you probably know that bounce is the angle of the sole on the sand wedge. A horizontal sole, when you hold the club up, if it's largely horizontal, that's low bounce. If the sole is tilted, that's a high bounce wedge, and the high would refer to the trailing edge. That's higher than the leading edge, and as you know by now, the amount of bounce you have on a club affects the contact you're going to be able to make with the ball, depending upon the lie you have and the conditions that you're playing in. High bounce is good. To give you an example, where you're playing in wet conditions and the club tends to dig when you hit the shot. A high bounce wedge with the trailing edge that is higher than the leading edge causes the club to dig less and skip more. You don't want it to dig too much, or you're going to hit what we all know as fat shots. You don't want to hit a fat shot. And so in those wet conditions from the fairway or from the rough, you want a high bounce wedge. Conversely, in the very same wet conditions, you will likely in other lies need a low bounce wedge. That is one where the trailing edge of the sole is roughly on level with the leading edge. And you need that for situations where you've got hard packed sand. And sometimes if you play municipal courses, the sand is hard packed all the time. I used to play a course, very nice in most respects, but I would refer to the sand traps as porcelain bathtubs, because you would hit down on the ball and your club would barely penetrate the sand. The sand was packed hard, even in dry conditions where it ought to be fluffy. The sand was packed hard. They needed to rework the traps. Eventually they did, and the sand became what one would hope for again. The golf course that I play now out here in Seattle, where we moved in 2019 from Chicago, having lived in Chicago for 18 years or so, has a very fluffy sand. And even when it rains there, and there's a fair amount of rain in Seattle, even when it rains, there is it's still fluffy sand. And it'll get harder as the season changes and the rain becomes heavier and more persistent. But for now anyway, it's fluffy, so you need a high bounce wedge because you don't want it to dig too much. You want it to skip more, because if it digs, you're going to hit a so-called fat shot and maybe not get out of the trap at all. But later in the year, I'm going to need, or if we've had a series of heavy rains where the sand is hard pack, I'm going to need a low bounce wedge. Think about the inverse relationship in weather conditions between sand and turf. When the turf is squishy, the sand is going to tend to be hard. And the inverse of that, or the converse, is true too, where it's dry conditions and the turf is hard, the sand is going to tend to be fluffy. So if you need for a fluffy lie, you need a lot of bounce. At the same time, you're going to, when you have a lie on the turf in those dry conditions, you're going to need a low bounce wedge. Hence, I suggest that you think about, depending on weather conditions, but you seriously think about carrying 2 wedges in your bag. And that would be true whether the weather is dry, because of the inverse relationship then, or whether the weather is wet. Again, when it's wet, you also have the inverse relationship between sand and turf. So that's the first big idea behind this series of videos. The second big idea, and then I'll get to, I think, a third big idea, and even a fourth, but the second big idea is that your sand wedges need to be heavy. They need to be heavier than those that are being sold today. Today, the swing weights, and let me just detour into what swing weight is. You probably can sense that already if you haven't studied it. Swing weight is how heavy the club feels when you swing it, a self-explanatory term. I submit that a heavy swing weight, that is a club with a heavier head, is better when it comes to sand wedges, because it will help you cut through either the sand if you're in the sand, or through the rough if you're in the rough. It allows you to shorten your backswing because you develop more inertia. One problem that you might have is when you encounter the rough, your club will slow down, and by the time the club hits the ball, it's slowed down too much, and you end up hitting a short shot, coming up way short of the target. To keep the momentum, the inertia going, it helps for the club to be heavy. Another reason why heavy is good is because it allows a shorter backswing. And I think a longer backswing generally contributes to less control and more randomness, because there's more distance for the club to travel, both back when you're taking it back and for the club to travel when you're bringing it forward. I think you're better off with a shorter backswing if you can do that. So, and heavy allows you to do that because you develop the momentum coming down more quickly and more firmly, and it allows a better follow through. So in sum, I'm suggesting 2 wedges, 1 low bounce, 1 high bounce, and that they be heavy. Now, as I mentioned, the wedges being sold today are swing weights of D3 through D5. For even a sand wedge, your clubs, your irons, have swing weights of D2, D3. So your sand wedge isn't really a heavier or much heavier swing weight than your irons. And I think that's unfortunate. I think the swing weight needs to be in the E's. Let me just give you a little quick overview of how they measure swing weight. It's on a scale from A through G. Those are the major gradations, and then within each of those gradations are minor gradations, numerical, 0 through 9. And so I just spoke of a D2 swing weight, or a D3, D5, but I've also, and I will speak mostly about here, E swing weights. I think that sand wedges should be in the E's. And fortunately for all of us, there was a time when the E swing weights were the most common. They were dominant. Not anymore. I don't even think you could buy an E swing weight. What you'd have to do is try and put a gobble of lead tape on the back of your Vokey or your Cleveland or your Mizuno, and keep adding layers of tape until you get to the desired swing weight. In back of me, by the way, by the TV, it's kind of fuzzy from this distance with this camera, but there's a swing weight scale, and you put the club in one end of the scale, and then you move the weight along until it achieves a balance, and the weight has an arrow that points to the swing weight that club being measured has. And so what I've done over the last number of months, with the tedium of being confined, I've for the first time gone out and measured the swing weights in my fairly extensive wedge collection, and it's allowed me to see patterns and allowed me to think more deeply about the wedges that one ought to carry, the wedges that I've liked. The wedges that I've liked tend to be heavy. They're in the E's. And again, it's for the reason that you have more inertia, you have a shorter backswing, you have more control, and I think you need, I think the shorter backswing and more control are valuable whether you're in the sand or whether you're on the turf. Be the turf rough or fairway or something in between. I've now given you a preview, and I want to justify why it is we ought to focus on sand wedges. Think about the number of times you don't hit a green in regulation. You are, as they say on the weekend when you're watching the golf tournament, you're out of position. You're out of position. Well, for a 15 to 25 handicap, you're out of position 14 or 15 times. For a 10 to 15 handicap, you're out of position 13 times. That's a lot of out of position. And again, most of the time, you're going to reach for a sand wedge. I will also talk about delicate chips a little bit. The other time the other club you sometimes reach for when you're out of position, if you barely miss the green, will be a pitching wedge or maybe a 9-iron, whatever it is you chip with. And I think that the classic old Wilson clubs, which will be the focus of this, we'll get into that, are better. And the reason I think that, I think the old Wilson pitching wedges, the old Wilson 9-irons from the late 50s, early 60s, they have something the modern ones don't. They have either neutral bounce or negative bounce. If you go buy a pitching wedge now from Vokey, the 48-degree wedge has 6 degrees of bounce. The 50-degree wedge, and I own 14 Vokeys, so I think I know what I'm talking about, has 8 degrees of bounce. And if you're in a tight lie, say you're in the dreaded patchy grass where there are little clumps of grass and then there's just dirt between the clumps, and we've all been nestled down between clumps on the dirt, and it's a real challenge to get a club on that. But the way you do it is with a no bounce or a low bounce pitching wedge or 9-iron. And I will talk more about that later, but that's what's coming up. So those are the major points that I will make. I want to give you a overview of the next 13 segments. I'm going to do 14 segments for you. I hope you'll bear with me, and I think you'll find value. And the reason I've got to do 14 and I can't just talk about, in general terms, huge bounce, minimal bounce, pitching wedges, sand wedges, I can't talk in just general terms, because the wedges that I'm going to focus on are Wilson Staff Dynapowered wedges made between 1956 and 1975, 20 years. There were 20 years that I have tended to collect. So I'm speaking from my own personal experience with Wilson Staff Dynapowered/Dynapowered wedges, but they varied from model cycle to model cycle. Sometimes they come out in 2-year cycles, sometimes they came out in 1 year, sometimes in 3-year cycles, and I need to discuss each of those because the bounce would vary and the swing weight would vary. And if you're going to be a consumer, if you're going to be out there trying to buy a heavy wedge with a swing weight in these, you can't buy it in the golf store. Where you're going to have to buy it is probably on eBay, and I've done 100 or more transactions on eBay. So toward the end of these 14 segments, I will talk about buying clubs on eBay and also about sprucing them up for play, putting a new grip on, maybe getting the rust off if there's some rust. But these are beautiful, well-made clubs. Wilson, why am I talking about them? Because they ruled the world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Hard to believe now because other golf companies get much more attention than Wilson, but I will document for you that Wilson ruled the world. And so we should take seriously the types of sand irons, sand wedges, and also irons. They used to call them irons as well before 1956. We should take seriously the sand irons and wedges that Wilson made, and also the pitching wedges that Wilson made. And then they had 2 other wedges that are basically like sand wedges, very, very heavy, called the dual wedge and the triple duty wedge, and you have no idea what those are probably. Those are bewildering terms. I'll explain what they are because they could play a role in your bag as one of the 2 sand wedges that you need. And again, eBay would be the source, and the years we're going to focus on mostly will be 56 through 75, and we're going to march through the years. I'm going to show you the clubs. What I'm giving you sharing in this series is information that you can't find anywhere else. Nowhere else, literally, will tell you the swing weight of the Wilson wedges. Literally, nowhere else can you look up the bounce of the Wilson wedges. You can look up in old Wilson catalogs the loft, they publish that, but they're not stamped on the clubs. You would need to consult the Wilson catalogs, and I've got those. But so I'm giving you information you can't find anything else. I'm also giving you the insights that I've already shared about carrying two wedges, about the inverse relationship between turf and sand. No matter whether you're in wet conditions or dry conditions, you've got an inverse relationship. I'm also sharing with you the benefit of the old Dynapowered pitching wedges, which by the way are 51 degrees, which is a modern gap, and the old 9-irons, which today that loft is called a pitching wedge, and how those had no bounce, which I think is something you need in your bag. So I practice what I preach. I play golf several times a week, and I carry 2 or even 3 sand wedges, and I carry a low bounce 9-iron for delicate chips. So having said all of that, preview, the 13 segments are going to march through the years, and then we're going to address the pre-19, just one episode, a short episode addressing quickly, mainly for those of you with an interest in history, and I will detour occasionally, forgive me, giving you little vignettes from history, or maybe even a couple of trivia questions. I think a lot of golfers are very interested in history, the history of the game. I know I've got a keen interest. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about eBay, we're going to talk about refurbishing clubs, we're going to talk about pitching wedges, the classic pitching wedges from that 20-year period. And so the episodes, I want to assure you, this one's going to run 23 minutes, pretty long. I like to keep them shorter if I can. The future episodes will be shorter, and there will be a number of them that are in the range of 6 to 8 minutes, which you'll find easier to snack on, if you will. I won't necessarily release all 14 episodes at once. You will have to check back. I'll probably put 7 or 8 up, and then I'll put more up later. So with all of that, there's the introduction. I want to encourage you to check into the next episode, where I will discuss why I have chosen Wilson, and I need to throw in some boilerplate now, and I'll put it at the very end as well. This is copyrighted by Thomas D. Sykes, 2020. All rights are reserved, and I don't claim any rights in the names of the golf club manufacturers mentioned, or their trademarks. So with that, I'll sign off, and you can rejoin me when the next episode comes on. Thank you.